They called me into the glass conference room at 9 sharp, just as the office was buzzing with end-of-quarter panic. $15 million in contracts were still dangling. Clients were growing restless, and legal was buried in signatures. Everyone knew this was the week the company couldn't afford mistakes. That's why the stairs burned hotter than the fluorescent lights as I stepped inside. Travis Holt was already there, arms folded like a man preparing to deliver a sermon. 3 department heads sat around the table, pretending to study their notes, while half the office leaned casually against the glass outside, gawking as if this were free theater. "Clarissa Vera," he began, voice smooth but sharpened with condescension. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Breach of trust." The words barely landed before he reached into a folder, pulled out a thick document, and slapped it against the glass table with the drama of a magician revealing his final trick. "My NDA, I'd remind you," he said, leaning forward. "This agreement carries strict confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions. Any discussion of internal matters outside approved channels will expose you to liability. You so much as whisper about this deal, and we'll own you." He smirked, certain he had caged me. The department heads shifted uneasily, as if wishing they could dissolve into the laminate floor. I studied the document, familiar lines of type blurring under the glare of the lights. I had written those very lines years ago, back when the company still valued precision over speed. I felt the room tilt, not from fear, but from the absurdity of watching him brandish a weapon he didn't understand. The silence stretched. Outside, someone pressed closer to the glass, craning for a better view. Travis's smirk deepened, convinced I was folding. Instead, I let the corners of my mouth lift in the faintest smile. I placed a hand gently on the NDA, as though recognizing an old friend, and said softly enough for only those at the table to hear funny, "I remember drafting that clause myself." Confusion rippled. Marla, the company's lawyer, froze mid-page turn. Travis blinked, not yet grasping the shift in weight. I rose without protest, slid the chair back into place, and walked out with deliberate calm. My pulse was steady, because I knew this wasn't an ending. It was the precise moment the trap had been sprung, and everything that followed would trace back to this document he had waved in my face. And I already knew which clause would decide the game. As I left that glass room, the weight of 15 years pressed harder than any accusation. My mind wandered backward, to nights when the office lights glowed long after most had gone home. I was always there, red pen in hand, poring over contracts until the numbers blurred, not because anyone demanded it, but because I believed in the company I helped hold together. I remembered defending us against lawsuits that would have swallowed smaller firms whole. I had caught the wording that saved millions in damages, rewrote the clauses that turned disasters into mere stumbles. No one cheered for me. No champagne corks, just quiet sighs of relief from executives who later forgot my name in board presentations. At home, my daughter grew up with the sound of keys tapping late into the night instead of bedtime stories. I missed school plays, birthdays, a handful of parent-teacher conferences. I told myself it was temporary, that the sacrifices built stability for her future. When another firm offered me nearly double my salary, I refused. Loyalty mattered more. At least that's what I thought then. Inside those walls, I became known as the seatbelt in a car full of speed freaks. They complained I slowed them down, but when the crashes came, and they always came, it was my clauses that kept them breathing. I never asked for recognition, just the quiet dignity of knowing my work mattered. And yet, after all the late nights, After the loyalty that bled into my bones, I was discarded in front of half the office, branded a liability by a man who had been here less than a year. It wasn't anger that rose in me then. It was clarity. Loyalty had been my shield, and now it was broken. As I walked down the corridor, past the curious stares and whispered speculation, a cold resolve settled in. If they thought they could erase me, they hadn't read the fine print closely enough, because loyalty may have chained me, but my knowledge was about to free me. Travis Holt arrived with the kind of swagger that only arrogance and borrowed charm can buy. He swept into the building as if the company were a stage built for his spotlight, flashing easy smiles at the board and tossing out acronyms that made him sound visionary to anyone who didn't know better. They ate it up. Fresh energy. They called it a new era. I called it a storm brewing without a forecast. He moved fast. Deliberately fast, like a Red Bull tornado ripping through every process I had spent years studying. Meetings that once required legal oversight suddenly ended with signatures before I even saw a draft. He liked to exclude me, to loop me in later, as if compliance were some optional garnish he could sprinkle over deals when it suited him. Soon the whispers started. Colleagues noticed contracts landing without proper review, vendors grumbling about terms that seemed unusually vague, but no one challenged him directly. He had the board's ear, and challenging him meant risking your place at the table. Instead, they whispered in break rooms and elevators, waiting for someone else to stop the car before it hit the wall. To Travis, I was legacy baggage. He said it once in a strategy session, not even looking at me, his tone light but deliberate, as though I were an outdated filing cabinet cluttering the corner. Laughter followed, nervous but complicit. I sat still, noting the weight of every word, storing it away like evidence. With every reckless move, I saw the foundations begin to crack, liability ignored, regulatory deadlines skipped, oversight replaced by his brand of bravado. The same contracts I once strengthened to shield us now dangled, thin as paper, ready to tear under the smallest strain. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to argue. All I had to do was watch carefully, quietly, and wait for the moment when his speed would collide with the brick wall he refused to see. And that collision was already forming, hidden inside the fine print of a deal he was rushing through. The file slid onto my desk late on a Tuesday, marked as finalized though I'd never seen the draft. A licensing agreement with a Canadian tech firm, glossy with promises and numbers too perfect to trust. At first glance, it looked like a win. The sort of partnership executives brag about at shareholder dinners. But buried in the boilerplate, 3 paragraphs down, the danger glared at me. It violated an existing NDA we held with one of our largest financial partners, a breach that would force disclosure under SEC regulations. I read it twice, then a third time, tracing the language with my pen, each word like a fuse inching toward flame. This wasn't oversight. This was negligence that could cost millions and drag us into federal court. I didn't raise my voice. I never did. Instead, I documented everything. Memo drafted, clauses cited, precedent listed, emails cross-referenced. Years of habit had taught me to let the facts speak louder than outrage. When I finished, I escalated through the proper compliance channels, careful and precise. Then I waited. It didn't take long. Hours later, a calendar ping summoned me to Travis Holt's glass office, his self-styled throne room. He was standing, as always, leaning against the edge of his desk with a cup of something green in his hand, as though posture alone made him powerful. "You don't like the deal?" he asked without even offering me a seat. "It conflicts with 3 standing agreements." I answered evenly. Disclosure would be mandatory. He raised a finger like I was a child, interrupting. No one reads the fine print. Stay in your lane. Clarissa. The words hung heavy, smug and final. My jaw tightened, but I didn't argue. I didn't plead or throw evidence on the table. I only nodded once, slowly, as if conceding, because what he didn't know was that every dismissal, every escalation ignored, every reckless signature was feeding directly into a clause I had written long before he arrived, and by firing me over this, he would hand me the sharpest weapon in the building. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The folder lay open before me, pages creased from years of handling, my handwriting still visible in the margins. It was my copy of the NDA, the one I had drafted 8 years ago with the guidance of our then General Counsel. I flipped carefully until I reached the section I knew by heart, Clause 12B. The words were dry, clinical, but they carried the force of a blade concealed in cloth. In the event of involuntary termination following a documented compliance escalation, the company shall assume full liability for all legal costs, damages, and defense, with no cap and no expiration. I remembered the day we wrote it. We were dealing with sensitive regulatory contracts, and the GC had insisted that staff like me, those buried deepest in risk management, deserved protection. My pen had shaped those sentences, every line sharpened to ensure no one raising a red flag could be crushed for doing their job. At the time, I thought it was a shield. I never imagined it would become my weapon. Travis, in all his arrogance, had slammed that NDA on the table thinking it would silence me. He hadn't read far enough. He didn't understand that by firing me for following compliance protocol, he had detonated his own safety net. From that moment on, the company carried my fight, whether they wanted to or not. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of what I held settling over me like armor. Loyalty had kept me quiet for years. Now the contract I had once designed to protect others would protect me. I closed the folder slowly, almost reverently, and slid it back into its sleeve. My path was no longer uncertain. The trap had been sprung, and I was holding the pin. And the first step was gathering every piece of evidence that proved just how reckless Travis had been. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, I sat at my desk at home, surrounded by glowing screens and piles of paper, building an archive brick by brick. 11 years of flagged memos, compliance summaries, and redlined contracts spilled across folders. I traced email chains back to the moment warnings were ignored, each timestamp proof that I had done my job while others turned away. I created categories, ignored escalations, SEC exposure risks, doctored agreements. The more I organized, the clearer the pattern became. Travis hadn't just been careless, he had been deliberate. Files showed language stripped out of contracts, risk sections erased as if liability could vanish with a keystroke, and then came the twist that burned hotter than his arrogance. Several of those contracts bore Marla Dayton's initials, neat and precise, marking her approval. The company's own counsel had signed off on Travis's shortcuts, making herself complicit. She hadn't been blind, she had been willing. Betrayal always cuts deeper when it wears a familiar face. I paused, staring at her initials. For years, I had trusted her judgment, even admired the way she carried herself in meetings. Now I saw those tidy strokes for what they were, a signature of surrender to power. I couldn't face this alone. So I picked up my phone and dialed Marlene Vicks. She had earned her reputation as a litigator who never raised her voice, but always drew blood. When she answered, I didn't need to explain much. She remembered me. She remembered the clause, "You've already won." she said. "Now let's make them realize it." Next, I sent a message to Angela Serrano, an auditor with a spine most people underestimated. Her reply came quickly. "Send me what you have. Carefully. By dawn." I wasn't just a fired manager with a box of files. I was part of a quiet axis evidence, law, and oversight aligned. And I knew the first strike would not come from me shouting in a boardroom, but from a letter that would land like a blade between their ribs. Marlene didn't waste words. Within 2 days, she had a draft that felt like a scalpel. 3 pages, surgical and cold. The first quoted Clause 12B in full, every syllable of indemnity laid bare. The second documented my termination immediately following a compliance escalation, the retaliation email, the attempt to silence me. The third warned of potential SEC exposure, politely inviting the board to resolve the matter before regulators were forced to act. It wasn't a threat. It was a diagnosis. We didn't send it to HR. We didn't send it to Travis. We sent it directly to the board's outside counsel, the one group with no interest in protecting his ego. I imagined the silence in those offices when they read it, the kind of silence that feels like smoke before fire. That same evening, I compiled a careful packet for Angela Serrano. Nothing dramatic, just contracts with redlined risks, memos, timelines. She called it an informal review, but we both knew what it meant. She would let it sit on her desk until the moment it was too big to ignore. Days passed, and the air inside the company shifted. Colleagues began messaging me off the record deals frozen, clients demanding clarifications, whispered panic echoing through the glass halls. Travis tried to bluff his way through, telling teams it was a temporary hiccup, but his voice carried strain. Then came the twist. One morning, a trade publication ran an article under the headline, "Systemic Risk Ignored at Major Tech Firm." The details were too precise to be speculation. The story outlined doctored contracts, suppressed compliance, and executive negligence. It didn't name me, but the fingerprints of my archive were all over it. Whether Angela shared it or a regulator passed it quietly along, I never found out. But the result was the same. The story spread like fire through dry brush, igniting questions the board could no longer dismiss. And when the letter from Marlene landed on their counsel's desk the very next day, it collided with the scandal already bleeding across the industry wires. The article still hung in the air like smoke when Marlene called. "They've scheduled a closed strategic session," she said. "It's happening today. Behind those sealed doors." The board gathered with their outside counsel. I wasn't there, but I knew the rhythm by heart. The lawyer would stand, throat tight, and read Clause 12B into the record unlimited indemnity. No cap, triggered the moment my termination followed a compliance escalation. Every director would feel the weight of those words drop like stone on glass. News reached me later from a sympathetic colleague. Travis had tried to crash the meeting, badge still granting him access. He stormed in, red-faced, waving a stack of contracts like a child demanding credit for homework. He ranted about innovation, about old staff sabotaging progress, about how the article was slander. But the board's silence was thicker than his words. Security had already been called. When the council finished, the vote was swift. Travis was suspended pending review, his access revoked by the end of the day. He left the building not with a speech, but with 2 guards at his side, the glass doors closing softly behind him. Yet the collapse didn't stop with him. Marla Dayton, the company's lawyer, had quietly gone on vacation just before the meeting. No notice. No explanation. Her initials sat on too many doctored contracts, her silence a signature as damning as ink. The board suspected complicity. I knew better. She hadn't merely been complicit, she had chosen survival over duty. Silence. In her hands. was guilt. I thought of her as I sat with Marlene later that night, the city lights burning across the skyline. Travis had fallen, but the system that enabled him remained intact. And if I wanted this not to vanish into sealed settlements and quiet resignations, I would need to push the blade deeper, because a reckoning with one man wasn't enough. The rot was in the foundation, and I still had more evidence left to place on the table. The email from Marlene arrived without preamble. One screenshot, black and white, time-stamped. The board's tally clear across the page, Travis Holt, terminated for cause. No severance, no vesting, no shield. The subject line read only delivered. I stared at it for a long time, the glow of the screen reflecting against the glass of my kitchen window. This was the moment most people would imagine champagne, a dance of vindication, but I felt none of that. No rush of triumph, no sweet taste of revenge, only a stillness, the kind that comes when a long fight has already been decided and all that remains is aftermath. The offers came quickly. Consulting packages, transition stipends, carefully worded settlements that smelled of hush money. Each one dangled financial comfort if I agreed to step aside quietly. I ignored them all. I had not spent 15 years holding this company together, only to sell my silence at a discount. Instead, I chose a different path. With Marlene's guidance, I approached a philanthropic foundation that specialized in corporate ethics. They had followed the story in the press, recognized the precedent of Clause 12B, and offered seed funding for something new, the Vera Integrity Institute. We built it, lean, focused, relentless. Its mission was simple: protect compliance professionals, ensure red flags could never again be buried under arrogance, and give employees the tools to fight back when their voices were silenced. Irony arrived swiftly. The first client contract we signed was with the very company that had tried to erase me. Forced by regulators and desperate to salvage credibility, the board voted to retain my institute for a full compliance audit. They would pay handsomely for the privilege of being judged by the woman they once cast aside. Sitting across from Marlene at our modest new office, I signed the engagement letter with steady hands. Revenge had never been the point. What mattered was legacy, something stronger than a single downfall. And as I slid the signed document back into its folder, I knew silence had built me a platform from which I could speak louder than ever before. The cafe was half empty, the kind of place where conversations drifted softly and the clink of cups filled the silence. I sat near the window with a mug of coffee cooling in my hands, watching the news ticker crawl across the mounted screen above the counter. The headline scrolled by in muted urgency: Tech firm restructures after compliance scandal. Board initiates independent oversight. No names were mentioned, but I didn't need them. I could read between every line. Their panic had become policy, their downfall a warning wrapped in polite corporate phrasing. I took a slow sip, the bitterness grounding me. People think silence is weakness, the space left when you lose your voice. But silence, in my hands, had been architecture. Each document I archived, each clause I drafted, each escalation ignored layer upon layer of foundation. By the time they realized it, the structure was already towering over them. He thought the NDA silenced me. Instead, it buried him. He thought I was legacy baggage, an old name to be discarded. Instead, I became the precedent whispered in every boardroom, the reminder carved into every compliance manual they would now be forced to read. Have you ever been underestimated until the rules you wrote became someone else's ruin? It is a strange kind of justice, quiet and absolute. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to shout. All I needed was to let the words I had written years ago do their work. Outside, The city kept moving, indifferent to victories or defeats. Inside, I folded the newspaper I had brought with me, slipped it into my bag, and finished the last of my coffee. They had fired me after years of loyalty, waving a contract like a weapon. And now, with every invoice signed to my new institute, they paid me to ensure people like them never rise again.